Welcome to the debate. So, I want you to imagine standing in front of a massive 250-year-old building.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, and half the crowd is, marveling at a flawless architectural achievement. But the other half is pointing at these deep, intentional fractures that were poured directly into the concrete foundation on day one.
Yeah, two completely different realities.
Exactly. And as the United States approaches its 250th anniversary, this is exactly what our national civic dialogue looks like. We are deeply fragmented, often vitriolic, and we completely lack a shared understanding of what we are even looking at.
The discord is palpable, isn't it? I mean, we are arriving at this monumental anniversary not with harmony, but with a profound inability to agree on our most basic historical, political, and social realities.
Yeah, it really does feel like everyone is looking at a completely different country.
Absolutely.
And to unpack why this impasse exists, we are examining Mike Green's 2026 work, America 250, through the lens of Black American history. Green actually provides a specific roadmap for this moment.
He really does.
He argues that to understand our current civic breakdown, we must recognize that the United States was established as an unbroken, intentionally designed, white, male-dominated power structure, one that maintains control through deliberate narrative propaganda.
Right, that's the core thesis.
So our central question today is this. Does Green's framework of a deliberate, continuous, and unified design accurately capture the complexity of America's history and its current conditions?
It's a heavy question.
It is, and my position is that looking at this structure as a deliberate, continuous design is absolutely the definitive objective lens required to understand American history.
Well, I hear that, but framing the structure as an absolute unified monolith ignores the profound systemic fractures that have, actually driven progress in this country.
You don't think it's a monolith?
No, I don't. Yes, the historical injustices documented in Green's material are undeniable facts. But if we only look at the unified dominance, we completely miss the vital historical allyships. We miss the internal vulnerabilities that have repeatedly forced the reconstruction of this nation.
Okay, well, let's start by looking at how this architecture was built. Because my argument is that America is not an accidental development of well-meaning people who occasionally stumbled into prejudice.
Right.
It is a deliberate construction of racial hierarchy. It was authorized by theology and codified by law. You can trace the exact blueprints.
The actual legal and religious foundation.
Exactly. Green points us directly to the 1493 doctrine of discovery. Pope Alexander VI essentially provided divine authorization for European Christian explorers to conquer lands and enslave non-Christian inhabitants with absolute impunity.
Wait, let's pause there. Because moving from a 1493 papal decree to actual American law centuries later, that's a big leap. How does Green connect that specific theology to the mechanical legislation of the United States?
That's the crucial link right there. That theology didn't just evaporate. It became the foundational logic for our legal code. Look at the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution.
Authored by John Adams, right?
Authored by John Adams, who, of course, became our first vice president and second president. Adams explicitly mandated 4 criteria for holding public office or leading an institution like Harvard University.
Right. You had to be white, male, own a specific amount of land, and be a professing Christian.
Precisely. And when Adams writes this, he isn't just expressing a cultural preference. Mechanically, he's building a financial and political firewall.
By keeping the power concentrated.
Yes, by linking public office to land ownership and then restricting who can actually acquire wealth and land based on race and gender, he legally guarantees that the levers of lawmaking remain strictly in the hands of one demographic for generations. It mathematically prevents systemic change.
Wow, yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. By 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney in the Dred Scott decision stated clearly that the Declaration of Independence was never meant for Black people. Taney didn't just express racism, he codified a jurisdictional lockout, stating the nation was exclusively a whites-only citizenry.
See, I validate that historical timeline entirely. The doctrine of discovery, the Massachusetts Constitution, the Dred Scott decision, these are facts of the historical record that actively shape the nation's DNA.
So you agree it's a design system?
I agree with the design, But where I diverge is on the conceptual framing of this system as an impenetrable, unified monolith. Green's own evidence points to profound systemic vulnerability.
Vulnerability in what sense? The laws were incredibly effective at maintaining control.
Vulnerability in the sense that the system routinely fractures under its own weight. Let's look at the Civil War. Green describes it not just as a conflict between states, but as the largest slave revolt in American history.
That is a very powerful reframing.
It is. He highlights that 200,000 black soldiers on the front lines, alongside 300,000 in support roles, effectively saved a white nation from itself. Furthermore, he explicitly notes that following the war, black people set about the task of redesigning the nation in direct allyship with, quote, white radicals in positions of power in Congress.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently when we look at how the establishment operates day to day to regain control.
But think about the mechanics of that progress. If the nation had to be saved by the very people it enslaved, and if constitutional progress like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments required deep allyship with actors inside the highest levels of the government, then the ruling architecture isn't unified.
You think it's divided?
It is characterized just as much by internal ideological civil war as it is by unified dominance. It's a system constantly at war with itself.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how the system absorbs those internal wars. Let's look at the mechanics of narrative control, because that is how the dominant system sustains itself through those fractures.
Okay, the narrative control.
Yeah. Green argues the establishment manipulates three influences: what we're told, what we learn, and what we experience. He uses this brilliant analogy of a pair of glasses forced upon the public.
Ah, right. The lenses of innocuous engagement and ignorance.
Exactly. Let's translate those academic terms. The first lens, innocuous engagement, is basically the PR strategy of softening historical atrocities so they don't look so bad in the history books.
Like calling enslaved people workers?
Yes, exactly. Framing the brutality of slavery as economic migration, or referring to enslaved people merely as workers. It frames these actions as just how things were done back then to avoid accountability.
And the second lens?
The second lens is ignorance, which is the active, surgical omission of facts. It's removing the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, or the doctrine of discovery, from K-12 education entirely.
And you're arguing this proves a unified design?
Absolutely. This isn't just a passive cultural habit. It is a highly coordinated, intentional design across educational institutions, the media, and faith-based organizations.
Coordinated across all three?
Yes, because when you control the textbook publishing boards, the broadcasting networks, and the pulpit simultaneously, you are executing a unified strategy of indoctrination. The very existence of this massive, coordinated propaganda apparatus proves the hierarchy operates with singular, unbroken intent.
I come at it from a different way. The problem with the glasses analogy is that propaganda requires a strict monopoly on information to actually work.
What do you mean?
Well, the system tries to put those glasses on the public, but it can't erase the lived experience of Black Americans. Green explicitly states that while the power structure can hide, omit, and distort the truth, it cannot completely control it.
Because the lived experience contradicts the curriculum.
Right. Oral histories and community realities act like a secondary lens that directly contradicts the first, creating cognitive dissonance that the establishment actually struggles to control.
But they still push the curriculum.
They do, but if the indoctrination is as absolute and systemically flawless as your framing suggests, how do we explain the persistent survival of the Black counter-narrative? The fact that these disruptive efforts have survived and continuously challenged the status quo from colonial times to the present day indicates that the monolith is highly porous.
Porous?
Yes, it lacks true hegemony, meaning it hasn't convinced everyone to just accept its rule as natural. The monopoly on information is constantly failing.
Well, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because when that monopoly on information is challenged, or when those cracks appear, the system doesn't shatter. It simply adapts and reinforces its dominance.
How so?
You brought up the Civil War and the Reconstruction era earlier, presenting it as a moment of profound systemic vulnerability and internal fracture. But look at what immediately followed mechanically.
You mean the backlash?
8 generations of coordinated backlash. Green points out that the efforts to reconstruct the nation triggered a massive realignment.
Right.
The political power structure, working hand in hand with the Christian conservative power structure, quickly mobilized to cement their control over every aspect of society. And this wasn't just a cultural mood.
No, it was legislative.
It was a devastating legislative and economic strategy. We are talking about Jim Crow laws, redlining, the unequal distribution of the GI Bill, mass incarceration. For 8 generations, this system has systematically refused to repent, refused to reconcile, and refused to repair the harm or return stolen wealth.
I'm not denying the severity of the backlash. It was brutal and systemic.
But don't you see how that proves the point? A system that can sustain 8 generations of coordinated legislative backlash against the 14th Amendment is not a fractured, vulnerable entity.
You think it shows strength?
It is a highly resilient monolith, executing a unified strategy of self-preservation. It absorbed the disruption of Reconstruction and successfully neutralized it.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered what the absolute necessity of that backlash actually reveals about the system's strength?
What do you mean?
Let's zoom in on the mechanics of that Reconstruction-era nuance. By acknowledging the vital allyship with white radicals in positions of power in Congress, Green's own text proves that the establishment was not acting with singular intent.
Well, there were outliers.
But you had members of that exact ruling demographic sitting in the highest seats of congressional power, actively working to dismantle the racial hierarchy and create a diverse, equitable society.
But they were eventually pushed out. The Compromise of 1877 removed federal troops from the South and handed power right back to the white conservative establishment.
Yes, they were pushed out, but the fact that they were there and that progress required exploiting those genuine ideological divisions within the ruling class is essential.
I see.
The backlash you're describing was so fierce, precisely because the internal fracture was so severe. The power structure wasn't just fighting an external threat, it was fighting a civil war within its own halls of power. Doesn't framing the system as a flawless monolith obscure the historical reality that allies inside the system are often the mechanism for dismantling it?
It obscures it only if you think those internal divisions ultimately change the fundamental nature of the system. I argue they didn't.
You don't think it changed?
No. The dominant structure absorbed the disruption and maintained its core trajectory of wealth and power concentration. And we can see this exact dynamic playing out today, which Green describes as a modern war.
Ah, you're referring to the demographic shifts.
Yes. As we approach the 250th anniversary, Green notes that the establishment is actively waging war against changing demographics. We are seeing a decline in the white birth rate and a steady influx of non-white immigrants.
Right, the shifting math.
Exactly. And why is that an existential threat to the system? Because the system's power is predicated on a mathematical majority, maintaining exclusive ownership of lands, businesses, and intellectual property. When the math changes, the system drops the PR of innocuous engagement and fights openly.
The text does mention that.
It notes that current political administrations are no longer pulling any punches. This aggressive, unyielding legislative defense of capital and political dominance is proof of the structure's enduring mission. It hasn't fractured. It has simply updated its tactics for the 21st century to maintain absolute dominance.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Look at the specific terminology Green uses to describe the current conditions, an existential threat in a system at war with demographic shifts.
Right, a war.
If a ruling architecture is relying on severe, panicked backlash and waging literal political and cultural war against basic mathematical realities like birth rates and immigration, does that indicate a system firmly in control?
It indicates a system that is defending itself effectively.
I completely disagree. It describes a desperate system that is fundamentally collapsing. A true monolith, a system with actual hegemony, doesn't need to wage a frantic, visible legislative war against the inevitable changing face of its population.
You think it would be quieter?
It would easily assimilate or control those changes without breaking a sweat. If you are legislating in a panic against demographics, you are losing your grip. I suggest that what Green identifies as an impenetrable force might actually be a structure in its fragile final defensive posture.
You think the vitriol we are seeing today is a sign of weakness?
Absolutely. The vitriol and antagonism we see in our civic dialogue today is beflex of an omnipotent monolith. It's the thrashing of a system that realizes its ideological foundation can no longer support the weight of a diverse, modern society. It is cracking under the cognitive dissonance we talked about earlier.
Yet, that thrashing is still causing immense, measurable damage. It still controls the levers of those three influences, what we are told, learned, and experience, for millions of citizens.
That is very true.
To have a productive civic dialogue at America 250, citizens must first acknowledge the documented reality of this dominant system. We have to trace it honestly, from Pope Alexander VI's doctrine of discovery through John Adams's Massachusetts Constitution, all the way to modern political redlining and demographic backlash.
I agree that understanding the unvarnished truth is the baseline for any real conversation.
Right, because productive discourse is mechanically impossible if half the table is wearing those lenses of innocuous engagement and ignorance. If we are softening atrocities and omitting the foundational laws that built the hierarchy, we can't fix anything.
We can't.
We must adopt the Black historical lens, grounded in lived experience, to finally see past the institutional propaganda and understand the actual blueprint of the nation we inherited.
On that, we are completely aligned. The foundational injustices, the theology of domination, the legal codification of racial hierarchy, these are undeniable mechanisms of our history. But my point remains.
Which is?
Focusing solely on the system as an unbroken, omnipotent monolith minimizes the historical power of resistance. It obscures the internal fractures, the diverse allyships, and the inherent fragility of a system that must constantly wage war simply to survive. Recognizing the vulnerability of the power structure isn't just an academic exercise. It is what gives us the practical blueprint for how to actually dismantle it. You can't dismantle a monolith, but you can dismantle a fractured system.
It seems we converge strongly on Green's central premise, then, that a truthful, unflinching look at the mechanics of our history is the only viable roadmap for national reconciliation.
Yes, absolutely.
We simply can't teach what we don't know, and we can't heal a society if we refuse to understand the legal and cultural conditions we were born into.
Couldn't agree more. There is no blame or shame for the chapter of history we happen to be born into, but there is a profound civic responsibility to understand how it was written. We just remain in substantive disagreement over whether that inherited structure is best understood through its unified oppressive design or through its historical vulnerabilities and ideological fractures.
And that brings us right back to the profound value of analyzing those three influences: what we are told, what we learn, and what we experience. Examining those influences forces us to confront our own biases.
Right. It forces us to look in the mirror.
Exactly. It forces us to ask why we perceive the mechanics of the nation the way we do. Unpacking these historical narratives offers so much more to explore in Mike Green's work, and we encourage everyone to delve into the source material themselves.
It really challenges all of us to ask a difficult question. As we reach this 250th anniversary, what exactly are we celebrating? And through whose historical lens are we viewing it?
As we stand before that 250-year-old building, the choice is ultimately ours. Will we keep marveling at the carefully constructed facade, or are we finally ready to inspect the cracks in the foundation?